guys, welcome back to a brand new series I'm calling Breaking the Field. In this series, we will be discussing women in sports, whether it is the athletes we watch and love today, to the people in the background, from the journalists to the analysts to the commentary. This is going to be all about them. We're going to be learning about everything from the evolution, from the first sports that women played, up until where we are at today, what we are seeing, how we are evolving, how women are becoming more involved in sports today. This is going to be episode 1, and it is all about the evolution of women's sports. Where did it all begin? So let's get into it. So in order for us to get sort of an understanding of where we're at today, comparing to where we were originally, we have to jump back all the way to 1870. 1870, women's sports were not necessarily made to be a competitive level. Women were not allowed technically to do that. It was more for the sake of recreation. It was more for the sake of pushing the mental mind and the physical ability of women and making sure that our bodies were still up to standard, especially given the fact that we are often childbearing or going through menstruation, and that was what men considered as a barrier to women back in 1870. So back then, the sports that they played were more informal and without rules, and just for the sake of getting some physical activity out of the day instead. As I mentioned, it did emphasize the importance of physical activity, not necessarily the competitive side to what we see today. But then we jump 30 years later to the beginning of the 1900s. This was sort of the turning point to women's sports. We began seeing clubs forming in the US and the UK where they were competing in various different things, but mainly tennis, croquet, bowling, and archery, as they were some of the most popular sports to be participating in. And women had actually created these groups and these areas themselves. There was no men involved in creating these. These were actually created as athletic and competitive competition for women by women. As a woman, it was seen as a negative thing or a threat to fertility, and often associated with menstruation. As I mentioned, it was often a barrier, and men often saw that that was not necessarily something that women needed to do. It was really something that we weren't needing to participate in. But being strong, as well as another barrier, was often seen as selfish and as an attention-seeking nature from women, and men didn't like that concept. So we were not allowed to do any kind of competitive things. So that's why the sports that were created were made by women for women. Then we get into the evolution of the Olympics. Now, obviously, we have had plenty of Olympics in the past century. There has been a lot, and there have been a lot of very inspirational people. We are going to go through just a few, and we are going to go through some of the key moments between 1900 right up until 2024. In the 1900s, women were allowed to compete at the Olympics for the very first time. But however, this was limited. So yes, we were allowed to compete, but we were only allowed to compete in the following: lawn tennis, golf, croquet, and sailing. It was very, very limited. There was no reason why. It was purely just the fact that that was the sports that women were allowed to compete in. There was no other mention as to why. There was no other meaning behind it. It was purely just the only sports that were available at the time. Then we jump to 1904, where boxing officially made its first ever appearance for women, but only as a demonstration. So it was not as a competitive nature. It was purely for the sake of a demonstration or an execution of showing, basically. There was no competitive nature to it. It was its first time being shown, and women were allowed to be part of a demonstration. By 1912, diving and swimming was added to the list of events. Australia actually had their first medalists with that event. We had Fanny Durack and Mina Wiley, who received gold and silver in the women's 100-meter freestyle. So on debut, pretty much, on the first year that we officially had swimming, Australia had sent competitors the Olympians, and we received a gold and a silver, which is pretty impressive, all things considered. By 1924, fencing had officially made its debut. By 1928, track and field events were allowed, events such as the 100 metre, the 800 metre, high jump, discus, and the 400 metre hurdles. They were the only ones at the time that women were allowed to compete in terms of track and field events. This obviously later changed, and we do now have a larger count of events for track and field, but at the time that was all we were able to do. By 1948, women were able to compete in canoeing for the very first time. 1952, Australia officially had its first Winter Olympians, Nancy Burley and Gwyneth Maloney. And then at the Summer Olympics, equestrian was officially added for women to compete in. So during these times, obviously we know that eventually women did get access to all of these events later on, but they were normally and traditionally only allowed for men. However, as we mentioned, later on they added more events. We were allowed to have more access to these areas. 1960. This was a major turning point for the Paralympic athletes in Australia, as its first female athlete was officially allowed to compete, Daphne Hilton, who officially was able to be the first woman ever to compete, and that was a pretty impressive thing for her to do, given how male-dominated the Paralympic and Olympic area was at the time. It was still super early on. We hadn't necessarily gotten to the stage where we were seeing lots of women participating, but it was really good to see our first Olympian, or first Paralympian even. 1964, women's volleyball made its Olympic debut, and the host city or the host country, Japan, actually took gold at it. Dawn Fraser competed and became the first Olympian to win 3 successive individual gold medals in the same event, which for her was the 100 metre freestyle. We know that Dawn Fraser is one of the most decorated Australian athletes to date. She was very impressive. We will discuss her in a later episode as well, but that was just to name a little short fact during the 1964 Olympics. By 1980, field hockey had officially made its debut as well, and at 1984, the first year women were allowed to take part in the Olympic marathon. At the Paralympics, Jan Randalls became the first female marathon gold medalist, winning the Class 4 wheelchair event. We know that there is various different events in the wheelchair series and the wheelchair events, and it was really impressive to see the first Australian, first female to actually receive a gold medal at this event. It was a very, very distinguished moment. By 1988, the Hockeyroos were the first Australian team sport to actually win Olympic gold. This was a very impressive thing, all things considered, given how many years we probably had been competing prior, and it was very impressive that we managed to finally get that. By 1991, the pivotal moment for change, the IOC had made mandatory changes for all new sports, which were allowing women to have competing ability in every single new event. So from the events that had been previously added, they didn't have that rule, but any event being added post 1991 must have female competitors in every event. So we had very, very quick changes and necessary changes, as a matter of fact. We really needed these changes for it to be a pivotal moment in the Olympics history to see more women participating. By 1996, women's football and softball became a medal event. Taking note the fact that they did exist, however, not to a competitive nature where we were competing for medals. By 1996, they officially created the medal event where we actually competed for the gold, silver, and bronze result. By 2002, Alyssa Camplin was the first female Winter Olympic gold medalist. 2010, Jess Gallagher became the first Australian woman to win a Winter Paralympic Game medalist, which was the bronze in the slalom visually impaired alongside her individual as well that was also assisting her during that race. By 2012, another pivotal moment, another major change, a necessary change, I think you would say. Every country competing at London in 2012 actually included female athletes. So every single country had brought at least one woman to the Olympic Games, which was a huge change to see and a very exciting change. And I'm sure that it would have been an impressive moment knowing how desperate we were to see women on that stage, on that large stage, you know, worldwide known. The Olympics is a big thing in the first place, let alone being a female heading off for the first time or the second time to the Olympics to represent your country. It was a very big opportunity. By 2016, Rugby Sevens was added to the sports program. Jess Gallagher was actually the first athlete to win the summer and the winter Paralympic medals. Melissa Tapper was the first Australian athlete to compete at the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And then we had 2019, where Shae Graham became the first woman selected for the Australian wheelchair rugby team. This as well, I think, is one of the greatest moments in kind of Australian sporting history, in a matter of speaking. The wheelchair rugby team was very male-oriented. It was very male-dominated. Until 2019, when Shae Graham came along and managed to score a position in the squad. And this was a huge opportunity to show how capable women were, especially in the Paralympic opportunities as well as the Olympic opportunities. We have plenty of women capable in Olympic and Paralympic, and it was really exciting to see their capabilities. 2020, this was a big year. We had the official change where one male and one female were able to be the flag bearers for the starting and the closing ceremony. We had women's 1500 meter freestyle, the mixed 4x100 relay, and the 4x400 meter relay were added to swimming. Women were finally allowed to compete in sprint canoe, BMX freestyle, karate, skateboarding, surfing, and sport climbing. And Emma McKeon became the most decorated Australian Olympian in history with 7 medals, 4 gold, 3 bronze, in a single series, in a single Olympics. That's a pretty impressive thing. We will also discuss Emma McKeon at a later date as well, in a later episode. But so impressive to see just how far we had ended up coming from where we had begun, not being allowed to compete in sport, having it as a recreation purpose, just for fun, not necessarily competing against our own, versus what we see today with some of the most decorated athletes, some of the most represented females in the world, and just how far we've come in how decorated and respected they are nowadays. Obviously, we still have a long way to go with lots of changes still, but it was the change that was needed. Back in the 1900s, it was the change that started the movement towards where we are today. And finally, we have our most recent one, the 2024. The first games, in history with full gender parity. There was more gender balance with the sports programs, with 28 out of 32 sports reaching full gender equality. And we also had Jess Fox, who became the most decorated slalom paddler in Olympic history, which kind of puts to the fact that, once again, women have been super representative of who they are, and realistically, Jess Fox becoming the most decorated slalom paddler in Olympic history, that is the most impressive thing as well. Being Olympic history is even further, because that goes back to the 1900s. That goes even further back, and that just shows the true capability that women do have and women can place themselves in. Obviously, we have, as I mentioned, so much more still to go, but considering we had in the 2024 games 28 out of 32 sports reaching full gender equality, meaning that there was even men and even women in most of the games, in most of the different sports at the Paris Olympics, is a pretty impressive result considering the timeline and how it had changed, how it had evolved in a manner of speaking. It is really putting to the importance of having women, and obviously seeing some of the most decorated Olympians, especially Australian Olympians, is a very impressive result as well. We had Dawn Fraser, we've got Emma McKeon, we've got Jess Fox, just some of the most brilliant female athletes to this day, representing the upcoming lineup of women leading on into the future for the Olympics is going to be a huge opportunity. We know that it's not just the Olympics that have this issue of gender equality. We know that it is sports around the world, whether it is the basketball, whether it's the AFL, whether it is the soccer. There is still that gender problem, but it is very good to see that there is a constant change, and we are working towards making that change and improving it. And I think this is going to be the most important part, is this is where we begun. This was the timeline. But what does the timeline look for the future? But that was the first episode of Breaking the Field, discussing all of the timeline from the 1800s right through till 2024, our most recent Olympics, and just giving you some insight into how it begun. How did women's sports start and where are we today? That was basically the entire episode. But thank you guys for listening and watching. We will be discussing the next episode very, very soon, and I will be very excited to continue this series. The second episode, I will tell you, is entitled Important Roles Taken Up by Women in Male-Dominated Sports. And we will be discussing the various roles that you can get into and you can work towards if this is something you truly aspire to do as a career or something you're wanting to pursue in life. But thanks so much for listening, guys, and watching. I appreciate you all. Thank you very much and have a good day. Goodbye.